There's a phrase most people have said at least once. Some have said it hundreds of times. I'll start Monday. Maybe for you it was a diet, a workout routine, a conversation you kept postponing, a decision you knew you needed to make. And Monday came and went. And then came another Monday and another promise. What's strange is that the promise always felt real in the moment you made it. You weren't lying to yourself. You genuinely believed it. So, what happened? This video isn't about willpower. It isn't about discipline. It isn't about building better habits or waking up earlier or finding the right system. It's about something quieter, something most people never stop to examine: the promise itself. Because what if the problem isn't that you keep breaking promises to yourself? What if the problem is that some promises were never meant to be kept? Think about the last time you made a promise to yourself. Not to someone else, to yourself. Maybe it was late at night, lying in bed, scrolling through your phone, feeling that familiar heaviness, the kind that comes when you know you've been avoiding something for too long. And in that moment, you made a decision. You told yourself, this is it. Monday, I start. And something shifted. The heaviness lifted, just a little, enough to let you fall asleep. That feeling, that small release of pressure, that's the part nobody talks about, because that feeling wasn't motivation, it wasn't commitment, it wasn't the beginning of change, it was relief. And relief, it turns out, is one of the most misunderstood forces in human behavior. Psychologist Roy Baumeister spent decades researching self-control, why people follow through on some things and abandon others. One of the patterns his work kept revealing was this: the act of planning a change, of deciding that change is coming, already produces a psychological reward. Not after the change, before it. The brain doesn't wait for you to act. It responds to the intention. You tell yourself you'll start Monday, and your nervous system registers something close to relief, as if part of the work is already done, which means the promise didn't prepare you for action. It replaced it. This is the mechanism most people never see, not because it's hidden, but because it feels so much like motivation that it's almost impossible to tell the difference in the moment. You feel the resolve, you feel the certainty, you feel like something has shifted, and something has shifted. Just not in the direction you think. What shifted is the pressure. The discomfort that was pushing you toward action has been temporarily released. And without that discomfort, the urgency fades. Monday arrives, the feeling is gone, and you wonder why you can't seem to follow through. But following through was never really the problem. The problem is that the promise worked exactly as your brain intended it to. It made you feel better, right now, without requiring anything from you. And a brain that has learned this, that a promise produces relief, will keep reaching for promises the way other people reach for a drink or a cigarette or anything else that makes the discomfort stop. Not because you're weak, not because you lack discipline, but because you're human. And your brain is very, very good at finding shortcuts to comfort. The question is, once you see the mechanism, what do you do with it? We'll get to that, but first, let's look at what these promises actually sound like, because they're more familiar than you might want to admit. Let's make this concrete. Think about someone who has been unhappy at their job for 3 years, not mildly unhappy. The kind of unhappy that follows them home, sits with them at dinner, keeps them awake at 2 a.m. Every few months, they say it. I'm going to look for something new. After the holidays, after this project wraps up, when the timing is better. And each time they say it, they feel a small wave of relief, because the promise confirms something important to them. They are not stuck. They are simply waiting for the right moment. But the right moment never arrives, because the promise keeps making the waiting bearable. The pain never builds to the point where action becomes unavoidable. The promise keeps releasing the pressure, just enough, just in time, to prevent the decision that would actually change things. This is what makes the pattern so difficult to break. It's not dramatic. It doesn't feel like self-sabotage. It feels like patience. It feels like wisdom. It feels like you're being responsible by waiting until you're truly ready. But ready is a feeling that promises produce, not a condition that precedes action. The people who actually change don't wait until they feel ready. They act while still feeling uncertain, still feeling afraid, still feeling like the timing isn't quite right. Because they've learned, sometimes the hard way, that the feeling of readiness you're waiting for, it was always just one more promise away. There's a specific set of phrases that function as promises in disguise. You've probably said most of them, some of them many times. I'll start Monday, after the new year, once things calm down at work, when the kids are older, after we move, when I have more money, when I have more time, when I feel better, when I'm ready. On the surface, these sound like plans, like someone who is thoughtful, patient, realistic about their circumstances, someone who understands that timing matters. But look more closely at what all of these phrases have in common. None of them require anything from you today. Every single one places the moment of action at a safe distance, close enough to feel real, far enough to feel painless. And that distance is not accidental. Your brain chose it deliberately, not out of laziness, not out of weakness, but out of a very sophisticated understanding of what you can tolerate right now. Because the brain's primary job is not to help you grow. It is not to help you become who you want to be. Its primary job, the one it has been performing for hundreds of thousands of years, is to protect you from pain, from discomfort, from the particular kind of fear that comes with real commitment. And real commitment is terrifying. Not because the action itself is so difficult, but because commitment closes doors. It ends the comfortable ambiguity of someday. It forces a confrontation with the possibility of failure. Real failure, not hypothetical failure. When you say, I'll start Monday, you haven't failed yet. You're still someone who is about to change. That version of yourself, the one who's just about to begin, is protected, untested, still full of potential. The moment you actually start, that protection disappears. Now you can succeed, but now you can also fail. And failure, when it arrives, doesn't just mean the diet didn't work or the business didn't take off. It means something about who you are. Or at least, that's what the brain fears. So the promise isn't just a delay, it's a shelter. A place you can live indefinitely as someone who is about to become something, without ever having to find out if you actually can. Psychologist Timothy Wilson studied the stories people tell themselves to manage discomfort. What his research kept revealing was that humans are remarkably skilled at constructing narratives that feel true, feel reasonable, feel even virtuous, and that simultaneously protect them from having to act. The promise fits perfectly into this pattern. It is a story you tell yourself that feels like progress, that feels like intention, that feels in many ways like the first step of the journey. But it isn't the first step. It's a very comfortable place to stand still. And the longer you stand there, the more familiar it becomes, the more it starts to feel like home. Until one day, you realize that you have been standing in the same place for years, surrounded by promises you made with complete sincerity, waiting for a Monday that never quite arrives the way you imagined it would. That's not weakness. That's not laziness. That is a mind doing exactly what minds do, protecting you from the discomfort of uncertainty, one promise at a time. The question isn't whether your brain will keep doing this. It will. The question is whether you're going to keep letting the promise feel like enough. And here's what makes this even more complicated. The promises don't just protect you from failure. Over time, they start to protect you from something else entirely, from the discomfort of knowing who you actually are right now, as opposed to who you've been promising to become. Because every promise carries an implied version of yourself. Someone thinner, stronger, more organized, more successful, more present. Someone who has finally figured it out. And as long as the promise exists, that version of you still exists too. Somewhere in the future. Waiting. The moment you stop making the promise, you have to reckon with the present. With what's actually here. With who you actually are when no future version of yourself is coming to save you. That reckoning is what the promise was always protecting you from. Not failure, not difficulty, but the quiet, uncomfortable truth of the present moment, and the person living in it. There's a moment most people can remember, even if they've never put it into words. It usually happens late at night, or on a Sunday evening, or in the quiet after something goes wrong. A moment when the gap between who you are and who you said you'd be becomes impossible to ignore. And in that moment, something interesting happens. Instead of sitting with that gap, instead of letting the discomfort of it actually land, the mind reaches for something familiar. Another promise. Not because you're dishonest, not because you don't mean it, but because the alternative, truly accepting where you are without the cushion of where you're going, is a kind of pain the mind will do almost anything to avoid. Researchers who study emotional regulation have a name for this pattern. They call it experiential avoidance. The tendency to escape internal discomfort, not by resolving it, but by replacing it with something that feels better in the short term. A drink, a distraction, a plan that starts next week. The promise is one of the most socially acceptable forms of experiential avoidance that exists. Nobody questions it. Nobody calls it avoidance. It looks like ambition. It looks like self-awareness. It looks like someone who knows what they need to do and is working up to it. But underneath, it functions the same way as any other escape. It interrupts the discomfort before the discomfort can do its job. Because discomfort has a job. That's the part nobody tells you. The unease you feel when you've been avoiding something important. That's not a malfunction. That's a signal, a pressure that exists precisely to push you toward action, toward honesty, toward the decision you've been postponing. When you make a promise, you release that pressure prematurely. The signal disappears, not because the situation changed, but because the mind found a way to feel better without changing anything at all. And so, the situation remains, the weeks pass, and eventually the pressure builds again until the next promise makes it stop. This is the cycle. Not dramatic, not obvious, just quiet and slow, and remarkably easy to spend years inside of without ever fully seeing it for what it is. The exit from this cycle doesn't begin with more discipline. It doesn't begin with a better system or a stronger commitment or a more detailed plan. It begins with something much harder. It begins with letting the discomfort stay. But what does it actually mean to let discomfort stay? It doesn't mean suffering. It doesn't mean forcing yourself to feel bad as some kind of punishment for past avoidance. It means something more specific than that. It means pausing before the promise, sitting with the gap for long enough to actually feel its weight, long enough for your brain to register that the situation is real, that it requires something from you, and that another promise is not going to be enough this time. Most people never reach that moment. The promise arrives too quickly. The relief comes before the discomfort has had time to do what it came to do. And this is where storytelling becomes important, because abstract ideas about avoidance are easy to dismiss. But when you see the pattern in a real life, it becomes much harder to look away. Consider someone who's been in the wrong relationship for a long time. Not abusive, not dramatic, just wrong. In the quiet, grinding way that slowly hollows a person out. Every few months, something happens that makes the reality impossible to ignore. A conversation that goes nowhere. A birthday that feels like going through the motions. A night when they lie next to someone and feel completely alone. And in those moments, they make a promise. Things will get better when we move. When the stress at work dies down. When we finally take that trip we've been talking about. When we have more time for each other. The promise doesn't fix the relationship. It was never designed to. It was designed to make the night bearable, to make it possible to fall asleep without making a decision that feels too large, too permanent, too frightening to make at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. And so the night passes, and the weeks pass, and the months, and the relationship continues. Held together not by genuine connection, but by a series of promises that keep the pain just manageable enough to avoid the truth. This isn't a story about a bad person. It's a story about a very human mind doing what human minds do. Reaching for relief when relief is available, even when relief is the one thing standing between you and the life you actually want. The promises aren't the problem. They're the symptom. The problem is the belief underneath them, that you are not capable of tolerating the discomfort of truth, that you need to be eased into reality slowly, carefully, with enough cushion to make it survivable. But that belief is wrong. You have tolerated hard things before. You have survived moments you were certain would break you. You have gotten through nights that felt impossible and mornings that required more from you than you thought you had. The discomfort of truth is survivable. It is finite. It has an end. The discomfort of avoidance doesn't. It just keeps returning in slightly different forms, asking the same question it has always been asking. Are you ready to stop postponing your own life? There's a difference between knowing something and deciding something. Most people who make promises to themselves know, on some level, what they need to do. They know the relationship isn't working. They know the job is wrong. They know the habit is damaging them. They know the conversation needs to happen. Knowing is not the problem. The problem is the space between knowing and deciding. And promises live in that space. They fill it. They make it comfortable. They transform what should be a temporary moment of uncertainty into a place you can inhabit for years. Deciding is different from knowing in one specific way. A decision has a cost. It closes something. It requires you to give up the version of yourself that was still weighing the options, still keeping doors open, still maintaining the comfortable fiction that you haven't chosen yet. When you decide, you choose. And choosing means accepting that you are no longer someone who might do things differently. You are someone who has done something, and now you have to live with what that means. That's why decisions are hard, in a way that promises never are. A promise asks nothing of your identity. It just adds a future intention to who you are. It doesn't subtract anything. You remain, in your own mind, someone who is about to change, which is a much more comfortable identity than someone who is changing right now, imperfectly, visibly, with no guarantee of success. This is what the philosopher William James was pointing at when he wrote that what you do every day is what you actually are, not what you intend to do, not what you plan to do starting Monday, what you do, repeatedly, in the ordinary moments when no one is watching and there's no promise required, because the action has simply become who you are. That shift from promising to being is the territory this video is moving toward. But before we get there, it's worth spending a moment on something that makes this pattern particularly difficult to see in yourself. Promises feel like self-awareness. They feel like honesty. They feel, in many cases, like the most mature response to a situation, acknowledging that something needs to change while being realistic about what you can handle right now. And sometimes they are. Sometimes a promise is genuinely the bridge between where you are and where you need to be. A real intention, followed by real action within a real time frame. But there's a way to tell the difference between a promise that leads somewhere and a promise that simply relieves pressure. Look at the pattern, not the promise. If you have made the same promise in different words, in different circumstances, to different versions of your future self, more than 3 times, the promise is no longer a bridge. It's a habit, a reflex, a way of managing a discomfort that you have never actually allowed yourself to fully feel. And the uncomfortable truth about that kind of promise is this: you already know it isn't going anywhere. Somewhere underneath the relief, underneath the temporary sense of resolution, there is a part of you that knows. That part is not cynical. It is not defeated. It is simply paying attention in a way the rest of you has refused to. And the question it keeps asking, quietly, every time a new promise is made, is the same question it has always asked. This time, or just another Monday? There's a moment most people can remember, even if they've never named it clearly. It's the moment when a promise stops feeling like hope and starts feeling like a habit. When you catch yourself saying the words, "I'll start Monday, I'll change after this, I'll deal with it when things settle down." And something in you doesn't quite believe it anymore. That moment is important, not because it means you failed, but because it means a part of you has started paying attention. The mind that notices the pattern is not the same mind that created it. Something has shifted. Some degree of honesty has entered the picture that wasn't there before. And that honesty, however uncomfortable, is the only real starting point. Not a new system, not a better plan, not a more specific Monday with more detailed intentions attached to it. Just the willingness to look at the pattern clearly, to say, I have been here before. I have felt this resolve before. I have made this promise before. And I know, somewhere beneath the relief, what usually happens next. That kind of honesty doesn't feel like progress. It feels like defeat. It feels like giving up on yourself. But it isn't. It's the first moment in a very long time that you've told yourself the truth. And truth, however late it arrives, is always the beginning of something real.
There's a particular kind of person most of us have encountered. At some point in our lives, someone who doesn't talk much about what they're going to do. Someone who doesn't announce their plans, doesn't share their intentions, doesn't post about their journey before the journey has actually begun. They just do things. And then, at some point, you notice. The wait is gone, the business exists, the book is finished, the relationship ended, and they've moved on. Something changed, and you only found out after it had already happened. These people can seem almost private to the point of being withholding, like they're keeping secrets. But they're not keeping secrets. They've just learned something that most people spend decades avoiding. They've learned that announcing a change and making a change are not just different things. They are, in many ways, opposite things. There's research behind this that feels counterintuitive the first time you encounter it. Psychologist Peter Gollwitzer studied what happens when people share their goals with others. The common assumption is that telling people what you plan to do creates accountability, that the social pressure of others knowing will push you to follow through. What his research found was often the opposite. When people shared their intentions, particularly identity-related goals, the kind that say something about who you are becoming, they experienced a premature sense of completion. The act of telling someone felt to the brain like a step toward the goal, which meant the goal felt slightly closer, which meant the urgency to act felt slightly less. In other words, talking about change can reduce the pressure to make it. And this connects directly to everything we've been exploring in this video. The promise is a form of announcement. Even when it's made only to yourself, it functions as a declaration. I am the kind of person who is about to do this. And that declaration carries a reward, a sense of identity, a forward movement of being someone with intentions. But identity built on intentions is fragile. It requires constant renewal, which is why the promises have to keep coming. The person who quietly does things has found a different source of identity. Not what they plan to be, what they actually are, based on what they've actually done. That identity doesn't need to be announced. It doesn't need to be protected by future promises. It's built from evidence, small, private, accumulated evidence that exists whether or not anyone else knows about it. This is the shift that changes everything. Not from laziness to discipline, not from weakness to strength, but from a self that is always about to begin to a self that is simply, quietly, already in motion. And that self doesn't need Monday. It doesn't need the new year, or the right circumstances, or the moment when everything finally lines up. It acts from where it is, with what it has, because it has learned that waiting for the perfect moment is just another promise wearing a different name. Think about what it would mean to live without the promise as a safety net. Not recklessly, not without intention, but without the habit of reaching for a future version of yourself every time the present one becomes uncomfortable. It would mean sitting with the gap, feeling its full weight, letting the discomfort of where you are right now exist, without immediately reaching for the relief of where you're going to be. That sounds simple. It is not simple, because the promise is fast. It arrives before you've even finished feeling the discomfort. It's been practiced so many times over so many years that it functions almost automatically, like a reflex, like blinking. And breaking a reflex requires something different from willpower. It requires noticing, just noticing, before the promise forms, before the relief arrives, that you are about to do the thing you have always done. That pause, however brief, is where something different becomes possible. Not a grand decision, not a radical transformation, just a question, asked honestly, in the space before the promise. What would I do right now if I knew Monday wasn't coming? Not someday, not when things improve, not after the trip or the project or the season changes, right now, with this life, in this body, at this age, with these circumstances. What is the smallest true thing I could do today? Not the thing that would fix everything, not the transformation,
Just the smallest action that would be honest, that would close the gap, even slightly, between who you are and who you've been promising to become. That question doesn't have a dramatic answer. It rarely does, but it has a real one. And real, however small, is always more powerful than perfect, however distant. The people who change, truly change, not just intend to, are not the ones who finally find enough willpower. They are the ones who stop waiting for a version of themselves that is ready and start working with the version that is here. Imperfect, uncertain, not fully ready, but here. And that is enough to begin.
There's a question that tends to surface at this point, and it's worth addressing directly. If promises are so counterproductive, does that mean you should stop making them entirely? Does it mean that planning is an illusion, that intention is useless, that the only thing that matters is action? Not exactly. The problem was never the promise itself. The problem is what the promise is being used for. A promise made to relieve pressure is a dead end. It takes the energy that should drive action and converts it into comfort. It borrows from the future to pay for the present. And like all debt, it accumulates. But a promise made from clarity is something different. It's not a release valve, it's a commitment. And commitments have a different relationship to identity than promises do. The distinction sounds subtle. It isn't. When you make a promise, you are speaking to the future. You are telling yourself that someone, some future version of you, more ready, more capable, more disciplined, will handle this. The promise is addressed to that person, which means it quietly lets the present version off the hook. A commitment is different. A commitment is addressed to the present. It says, I, as I am right now, with everything I have and don't have, am going to do this. Not someday, starting now, even if I'm not ready, even if the conditions aren't right, even if I'm afraid. That's why commitments are rarer than promises. They cost something immediately. They don't offer the same relief. They don't let you feel better before you've done anything. But they build something that promises never can. They build evidence. Every time you follow through on a real commitment, not perfectly, not dramatically, but honestly, you add a piece of evidence to an internal record that your mind keeps whether you're aware of it or not. That record is what people actually mean when they talk about self-trust. Self-trust is not a feeling you generate by believing in yourself. It is not the result of positive self-talk or visualization or conviction. It is the result of a pattern of doing what you said you would do in small ways over time without an audience. And here's what makes this particularly important for anyone who has spent years inside the promise cycle.
The record doesn't require perfection. It doesn't require grand gestures. It doesn't require you to overhaul your life on a Monday in January with a complete set of new habits and a color-coded schedule. It requires one honest action, followed by another, followed by another. Not because each action is significant in itself, but because each action is a piece of evidence. And evidence, accumulated over time, becomes the foundation of a self that no longer needs promises, because it already knows from experience what it is capable of. This is what reliable people understand that others don't. Reliable people, the ones you know will do what they say, the ones whose word means something, are not more disciplined than everyone else in some innate genetic sense. They have simply learned, through repetition, that their actions and their words need to match. And they've learned that the only way to keep that match is to be careful about what they say in the first place. They make fewer promises. Not because they're cautious or pessimistic or afraid to commit, but because they've understood that a promise made carelessly is a small betrayal of yourself. And that small betrayals, repeated often enough, erode something that takes a long time to rebuild. So they speak less about what they're going to do. And they do more of it quietly, without announcement, without the need for the promise to make it feel real. Because for them, it's already real. The action makes it real. Not the intention, not the plan, not the Monday that was supposed to change everything. The action. Small, honest, repeated. That's the whole thing. And this brings up something that most self-improvement content gets completely wrong. The focus is almost always on motivation, on finding the reason that's strong enough, the why that's compelling enough, the vision that's vivid enough to carry you through. But motivation is a feeling, and feelings, as we've established, are exactly what the promise has been managing all along. Chasing motivation is just another version of waiting for Monday. Waiting until you feel ready. Waiting until the conditions are right. Waiting until something external shifts the internal state enough to make action feel possible. The people who build real self-trust don't wait for motivation. They act in its absence. They do the small thing on the days when it feels pointless, when the result is invisible, when no one is watching and there is no reward except the quiet knowledge that they did what they said they would do. That knowledge is not dramatic. It doesn't feel like a breakthrough, but it stays. It accumulates. And over time, it becomes the most reliable thing a person can possess. Not a promise about who they'll be, but evidence of who they already are. There's a version of this conversation that ends with a list. 5 steps to stop making empty promises. 3 habits to build self-trust. A framework for turning intentions into actions. But that would be another promise, dressed up as advice. So instead, let's end with something more honest. You already know what you've been avoiding. You don't need a new system to tell you. You don't need a better framework or a more detailed plan or a Monday with more conviction behind it. You know, you've known for a while. The question was never what to do. The question was always whether you were willing to stop using the promise as a reason not to do it. And that question doesn't have a technique as its answer. It has a choice, not a dramatic choice, not a declaration you make to anyone else, not something you post about or announce or build a narrative around, just a quiet, private, unglamorous choice, made in an ordinary moment, without applause, without certainty, without any guarantee that it will work. The choice to stop waiting for Monday. Not because Monday is a bad day to start, but because Monday has become a place you live, a permanent destination that keeps moving, a promise you've made so many times it has lost all meaning except the temporary relief it provides. There's a line from William James that has stayed with me since the first time I encountered it. He didn't write it as advice, he wrote it as an observation about how human character actually forms. He said that the evidence of what a person is can be found not in their intentions, but in the texture of their ordinary days, in the small, repeated, unremarkable actions that nobody sees and nobody celebrates, but that accumulate over time into something that can't be faked. Not the promise of who you're going to be, the reality of who you already are, built one quiet action at a time. Most people spend their lives waiting for a version of themselves that is ready. More organized, more motivated, more certain. A version that has finally figured out the right moment to begin. That version is not coming. It was never coming. Because readiness is not a condition that precedes action. Readiness is what action produces. You don't become someone who follows through by waiting until you're the kind of person who follows through. You become that person by following through, imperfectly, uncertainly, on an ordinary day that feels nothing like a beginning. Maybe today, maybe not. But consider this. You've already spent a significant amount of your life on the other side of this choice. You know what that feels like. You know the particular weight of carrying promises you no longer fully believe. You know the quiet erosion that happens when the gap between who you are and who you said you'd be becomes something you've simply stopped looking at directly. You know what Monday costs. The only question left is whether you're willing to find out what it costs to stop waiting for it. Not with a promise, with something smaller, something real, something you can do today, in the next hour, in the next 10 minutes, before the relief of another intention makes it unnecessary. Your life doesn't need a better Monday. It needs you. Here. Now. As you actually are. That has always been enough to begin. And if you're waiting for permission to begin without being ready, this is it. Not because you've earned it. Not because the circumstances are finally right, but because permission was never the thing standing between you and the life you've been promising yourself. The thing standing between you was the promise itself. Here's what that means in practice. When the next moment of discomfort arrives, and it will, probably soon, notice what your mind reaches for. Notice the specific shape of the promise that forms. Notice how quickly the relief follows. And before that relief settles in and makes the present bearable again. Ask yourself one question. Is this a promise I'm making to change something, or a promise I'm making to feel better about not changing it yet? You'll know the answer. You always do. The work is not in finding the answer. The work is in being honest enough to act on it. That's what discipline actually is, stripped of everything the word has accumulated. The motivational posters, the cold showers, the 5 a.m. alarms, the performance of transformation. Discipline, at its core, is just honesty made into a habit. The honesty to see clearly. The honesty to admit what you've been avoiding. The honesty to act from where you actually are instead of where you've been promising to be. It doesn't start on Monday. It starts in the moment you decide to stop pretending that Monday was ever the point. Trust is not built in the promises you make to yourself. It is built in the promises you finally stop making.